I want you guys to consider this. Our ancestors used to carve symbols and pictures into stone. And now today, especially if you go out there in the hall, we have all these amazing tools. We have this fantastic technology, but the impulse is the same. We're driven as humans to share our collective, our singular human experience. It's in our DNA. In fact, we have evolved and become the people that we are because of that influence and because we've been able to share our story with each other down through the ages. The people that carved those petroglyphs, and honestly, no one knows how old they are. They might be 10,000 years old. They might be 20,000 years old. Those are the same people as you and I, the same intelligence. And I want to make the point right off the bat that Hollywood and books and movies and cartoons and things, they like to show our human ancestors as primitive and not as intelligent. Those people had the same intellect, the same intelligence, the same creativity. They didn't have the technology, but they were doing everything they could to pass on information and to pass on their story. And that's what we're all doing here today, kind of in this building with all these tools. We've all come here because we have that urge inside of us. But let me back up. All right. This is only my second time in New York City, and I've been all over the world, but I've only been here one other time 19 years ago. I've actually been to Peru more times than I've been to New York City. I've been to Africa more times than I've been to New York City. But this place is iconic and mythological, and it has a power, and there's so many stories here. It wasn't always the case. I grew up in remote Alaska. This is actually my childhood. That's actually where I was living when I was probably 5 years old. And that's my little brother David, and we had sled dogs. Now, I didn't have electricity or indoor plumbing. I had an outhouse until I was 18 and moved out and went to college. And that's how I was raised, okay? I didn't see a TV sometimes for months at a time. Until I was deep into my teen years, I could count on one hand the number of times I had been to a movie theater. It was a holy experience to me every time I got to go see a film. It was my favorite thing. I used to sit on the floor next to our little wood stove and just pore over piles of magazines, Life magazine, National Geographic, and I would look at all these amazing places that I wanted to go, but they just seemed like they were in another universe. And I felt like I was way off in the middle of nowhere in remote Alaska, and everything was happening, and I was missing out on everything. And I was born into this life of just being so far away and so isolated. Like, you have to understand, folks, there's no restaurants. Like having a cheeseburger was a big deal. Like sitting down in a restaurant, having a pizza. You know, we'd go to town maybe once every 1 or 2 months, and oftentimes I wouldn't even get to go. Okay, we lived way off the highway. So that's how I grew up. I would dream of all these places I wanted to see. Paris or Rome. I wanted to see the Amazon jungle. I wanted to see big mountains. I wanted to swim in the ocean. And it all just seemed like so far away, and I was missing out on everything. Well, I grew up, and I went out into the world, and I hurled myself at it. And I have scars to prove it. And at this point, you have caught me at a pretty introspective time in my life. I'm going to turn 50 in 3 weeks. So maybe that's why I'm interested in prehistory. I've so far resisted the urge to get a Corvette and an earring. Yes. But I happen to be right now sort of researching and developing a project on prehistoric America. So there you have the petroglyphs. That's very much on my mind, and I'm fascinated by it, and I'm fascinated by where we came from. And I thought about what what should we talk about here today? And these are the things that are in my head, our personal mythology, our own journey. I thought, well, at this point, I could tell you about Paris. I could tell you about Rome. I could tell you about Bangkok. I could tell you about Moscow. I could tell you about looking at the wrong end of about a half a dozen AK-47s in a Mozambique jungle. I could tell you about swimming with piranhas in the Amazon. I could tell you some pretty scary things, getting charged by a herd of elephants. I could tell you amazing things. I could tell you about a psychedelic sunset in Death Valley. But I'm not going to talk about any of those things. I'm going to tell you a story about the summer of 1980 when I was 6 years old. And parts of this story I've never told anybody. That's me, by the way, inside whatever cabin we were. Now, if you don't have indoor plumbing and you have to go to the bathroom in the middle of the winter, you got to put on your boots and you got to put on a jacket, and there's no electricity and there's no batteries for flashlights, so you have a kerosene lantern. So that's what that picture is. All these photos, well, we'll get to that. Okay, so my parents, let me just set the stage for you. Some of you are old enough to understand. I don't know if you've been to Alaska, but you know, it's got the name of the last frontier. In the 70s, when I grew up, the 70s and the 80s, it was a lot wilder than it is today. That's a long time ago now. So my parents came from the West Coast, from Washington State. My dad was a little older. He went through Vietnam in the late 60s. He got out of that. He was kind of messed up. He met my mom. She was a little bit younger. They started raising horses. And in 1970, they decided they wanted to move to Alaska and kind of start a new life and live this frontier life. Alaska was very wild. So me growing up, there was all these kind of crazy characters around all the time. People that went up there, they're living on the fringe of society. They're out, you know, you did have metropolitan areas in Alaska. You have Juneau, where the capital is. Down in Southeast, you have Anchorage, which is the biggest city right in South Central, and then Fairbanks to the north. There's universities there, there's politics. But outside of that, you don't have to go more than a few miles, and it's very wild. You start running out of utilities. There's no electricity. There's no running water a lot of times. And there's a lot of people that ended up there because they're on the run. They're maybe running from a past life, sometimes running from the law, sometimes running from themselves. So I sort of grew up with this frontier mentality of we're going to go out into the wilderness, we're going to stake our claim, and we're going to make something out of this. And there were people with strange nicknames and strange pasts that maybe they didn't want you to know about it. That's how I was raised. There was always horses around. There were sled dogs. My dad was a pretty handy guy. He learned right away when he got up there, he got into dog mushing, and he learned how to build dog sleds, and he started developing race sleds, and he built sleds for some of the original people that ran the Iditarod sled dog race, if you know what that is. It's a 1,000-mile sled dog race that goes from near Anchorage all the way to Nome up in western Alaska. It's a pretty epic race. I was born in 1973. A couple years later, my brother David was born, and shortly after that, my parents split up. And my dad kind of moved up into the interior. My mom eventually remarried, and in 1980, when I was 6 years old, we went on this journey into the wilderness in the summer. We went with a group of people, and we traveled via wagon with horses and with some dogs. It was our little family, my mother, my stepfather, me, my brother David, and then my very young brother Andy, who was 9 years old. And there was another family, a married couple, Mike and Cherry. That's Cherry right there, sitting on the floor of our cabin later with a camera. We'll get to that. All these photos I'm going to show you were taken by Cherry. So Cherry was my mom's best friend. And her husband, Mikey, was a little bit older. They're both still alive. Michael had been to Vietnam. He's kind of this outlaw character. He had long hair and a long beard. They wore leather clothing that Cherry handmade. They had horses. They had a big old hound dog. So my family traveled in a wagon. Their family traveled on horseback. Cherry's younger brother Monty went with us, and then there was this other guy named Zeke. So there was 3 kids. My family, 2 adults, Mike and Cherry, 2 other adults, 6 adults. There's 9 of us. Now what we're doing is we're going to go into the mountains for the entire summer, from May until August. Where in Alaska, you ask? You start in Anchorage, and you drive north. I should reverse this because I'm reversed to you guys. If you drive sort of northeast towards the Canadian border, you gradually raise in elevation. You get up to about 4,000 feet, about a spot near there on the highway. Then you pull over, and then we went north from there, 50 miles into the wilderness. There's barely more, there's no road. There's like a little dirt track. And we had a destination in mind, which is this, to me, even now, 44 years later, it's sort of a mythic place. Where we were going was this place called Horse Pasture Pass, which off the highway, it's 50 miles back in the wilderness, and it's this kind of large alpine meadow, and it's subalpine. Now this terrain where we're going, it's all been smoothed over and carved out by glaciers thousands of years ago. So there's not jagged peaks or anything. It's sort of gradually rising, rolling hills. But there's not a lot of soil. It's kind of right on the bedrock. So that's the terrain. It's at high enough altitude that there's not big timber. In this picture that you're looking at now, this is probably one of the very first campsites we made because of the trees. Once you get to higher elevation, there's no trees. There's willow bushes and that kind of thing. So let me set the stage. You're looking at, that's actually me in the middle there with that mask on. I don't know what that's all about. Cherry, who took the pictures, let me back up here. There's Cherry. We'll go here. That's her husband, Mikey, sitting on the ground there, and he's got my little brother, Andy, on his lap. You can see Mikey's got a big old beard and long hair. I think that guy on the right with a feather in his hat is Zeke. Zeke was a single guy. He was back there. And then on the left, I think that's my stepfather and Cherry's brother, Monty, with the hat on. That horse is called Yellerbutt. That was my stepfather's horse. Yellerbutt was a big horse, really cool, nice riding horse. If he got out of his halter or he got off of his tether, he would run away and he's hard to catch. So that was the thing about Yellerbutt. I could tell you a lot of stories about him. Let's go back to Cherry. There's Cherry. Cherry came from the West Coast as well, or actually Spokane, Washington, which is, it's not on the coast, but it's Washington. It's basically West Coast. I found this picture when I was putting this together, and I didn't know this picture existed, but I had a whole shoebox of old pictures, and I went through them to put this together, and I found this, and I don't remember ever seeing it before. It's kind of a miracle. So I texted Cherry. I said, what kind of camera did you have? And she didn't know. And she had given that camera to her nieces, who are adults now and photographers. So she called them up to find out what kind of camera that is. I can clarify. It's a Mamiya 35 millimeter camera. I don't know if she bought it from B&H, but that picture was probably taken in the late 70s or early 80s, and B&H was definitely around, so there's a good chance that she bought it out of a B&H catalog. Maybe. I saw the whole history last night, so anyways. Back to the story. So let me just explain to you what this journey's like. I'm 6 years old. I have done first grade, and I'm fresh out of first grade. Here we are in the mountains. We're traveling by wagon. We're living in teepees. So my family has a teepee. Mike and Cherry have a teepee. There's the 2 single guys, Cherry's brother Monty and Zeke. Now Monty has some visqueen, basically a plastic tarp, and he sets that up with a little pole and makes his own makeshift teepee. I was 6, so I was always I didn't understand why all the other adults didn't just sleep in the same teepee. But Mike and Cherry, of course, are a married couple, and they don't want some other men in their house, in their bedroom. Now Zeke, the guy you see here on the right, Zeke was a cool dude, very quiet. What Zeke did, he rode around, and you're going to see a picture. There's my mom, 2 of my brothers, teepee in the background. There's me and my brothers leaning up against a teepee. There is now Frank, the other single guy. Frank rode on that mule. I'm sorry, Zeke rode on that mule, Frank. That was his mule, named Frank. And where Zeke would sleep is Zeke would find, down in low elevations, he would find a big black spruce tree. And he would find just the right tree that had enough space under it and a big open area, and then the spruce boughs and the coniferous, the pine needles would shelter him if it rained. And so we always spotted these certain trees, and we'd call them Zeke trees, meaning they were a good tree to sleep under. So I'll tell you here, like even today, I can spot a Zeke tree like that, and I think about that. It's a Zeke tree. So what a character. He rode around on a mule, slept under trees. There's Monty on the right, or Mikey on the right. There's my brother David with Frank the mule. There's me and my brother Dave. There's a little snow behind us, so this tells me this is really early, one of the first campsites. There's our camp. There's my little brother Andy in the background. So there's, that picture's a little out of focus, but I think it's cool. There's Mikey with his big old outlaw beard and his hat and his leather clothes. And that's Cherry's brother Monty, pranksters. Now these two guys, I'm the oldest kid, but I'm 6 years old. We had a big family eventually. I had 3 more siblings eventually, and being the oldest, I was always sort of tasked with, I'm just the live-in babysitter. So I was changing diapers from the time I was 7, 8 years old. That's just what you do. Hey, watch the kids. Okay, that was my job. But these two guys, pretty much my whole childhood, because they were around my whole childhood, and they're both still alive, and I still talk to them, and I don't see them very much because we live in different states, but they're as dear to me as any blood relative. They were like my big brothers. And yes, they're adult men. Monty's in his early 20s here. Mikey's in his 30s. He's been through Vietnam. But they were my big brothers, and they're pranksters, they're jokesters. We would go fishing together at streams, catch grayling. Our favorite pastime was cutting willows and cutting the branches off of them and making swords and playing pirates. And so we would do that for hours. The other favorite pastime was throwing horse apples at each other, especially when they're green and fresh, because they leave a mark and you know if you've hit somebody. I don't know if you've ever experienced that. Okay, so that's me on a horse. We had this other horse called, well, our parents had bought, David, my brother and I, a half horse, half Shetland pony. They thought, well, okay, we'll ride this horse. I could ride this horse into the mountains. And they said, Ben, what do you want to name this pony that we got for you? And I had been in first grade, and I had read this book about the moon mouse. And apparently that book left a mark on me, and so I named the horse Moony Mouse, and they weren't really fond of that name. But the name stuck. So here I am trying to learn how to ride this pony in the mountains. It's supposed to be my horse to ride up on this 50-mile journey into the mountains. But that's me getting bucked off. Way to catch the action shot, Cherry. Moony Mouse never did like being ridden, so we actually kept her for 7 or 8 years, but she was never really rideable. She would always buck you off. So this is, we're on this journey, and we're traveling. What we would do is we have to go 50 miles. So when we're going to be in the mountains for 3 months. Now, wagons don't travel very fast. We had 2 horses to pull the wagons. Moony Mouse is tethered behind the wagon. My parents and my 2 little brothers would ride in the wagon. That leaves me. I would then ride on this other adult horse that, because I couldn't ride a Moony Mouse, she kept bucking me off. We had this other horse called Durward. I know, I don't know who named these animals, but this horse was called Durward. He was an Appaloosa, kind of gray, speckled gray, and he was really big. He wouldn't buck you off. He wasn't dangerous like that. You could put a kid on him, and he was very, very stubborn. So what we used Durward for was to carry the teepee poles. And now you probably haven't thought about this. Where do you put the teepee poles? So we have 2 teepees, one for our family, one for Mike and Cherry. How you carry the teepee poles is you bundle one for this teepee, one for that teepee. You put them in this big bundle, you lash them together, and you tie them on either side of a horse. And then that horse, you just lead that horse along, and he drags these teepee poles behind him. So the tips actually end up, they get drug on the ground like 50 miles, and they get very sharp. But I ended up, because I couldn't ride on the pony, I ended up riding on Durward. And that was cool, it was fine, but he wasn't tied to the wagon, he wasn't tied to anything, I'm just on him, and so I have to control Durward, and I have to keep him in line and following the other horses. He couldn't, of course, run because he's got these teepee poles tied to him. But he can go off and do his own thing, and I do remember one time, this is a memory that really sticks with me because this is early in the trip, and I'm riding Durward, and he's got the teepee poles, and here comes this moose, this massive moose. I don't know if you guys have ever seen moose, but they're pretty impressive. They're huge animals. And this one, I remember it like it was yesterday. He had this massive rack of antlers, like they were really big. He was probably a trophy moose. And he just comes out from behind the bushes, and we are in such a remote place. Back then, there's really no motorized vehicles going back there. This is kind of pre-four-wheelers or three-wheelers. Nobody would really take a motorcycle back there. You could probably do an off-road bike. These animals are not used to seeing people. We're not making a lot of noise. We're traveling through the wilderness. You got a wagon creaking along. You got people riding horses. You could easily sneak right up on animals, and we did this all the time. We would come up and we would see herds of caribou. We saw a lot of grizzly bears. We saw a lot of moose. And just because we're just kind of cruising along, and they're not used to seeing people, so they don't immediately sense danger, more curiosity, except for bears. Bears, generally, you just see them running away. That's been my experience with wild bears, is sometimes a little bit of curiosity, but mostly running away. Well, this moose, I'm on Durward with the teepee poles. Here comes this moose. He's curious. And you know what? Durward is curious too. So Durward is going right for this moose. The moose is coming right for us, and I'm just stuck on the back of this horse. And I remember my heart rate elevating, and I'm kind of looking back at the adults like, are you going to do something? And they're all just kind of sitting there on top of their own horses looking at me. Eventually, the moose just wandered off, and Durward didn't get any closer, but it was a scary moment. This is some kind of campsite. That's Mikey, and he's got a gold pan, and I think it's over a fire, so he's seasoning that gold pan. Mikey fancied himself as a kind of a prospector. He brought a little bitty gas-powered, gas-powered suction dredge, and he had a bunch of gold pans. So every time when we would camp, we would always camp by a creek, and so he was down there panning for gold, and we would all do that. It's super fun. I know we never really found anything of substance, but you would always find little flakes of gold, and that's really, really exciting if you're a kid. There we are. So here he is. He's got a little sluice box there, and there's a gold pan, and there's my brother Andy on the far right. There's me and David. I got the black cowboy hat. That's my brother David right next to me. This is kind of how we're living. So we're not breaking camp every day. We're kind of like moving in stages. You know, if you're doing this, you have to camp by a creek. So we'll move along, we'll stop at a creek, we'll camp for 3 or 4 days or a week. I don't really remember, but I think it took us about a month to get to the ultimate destination. But we'll come to a creek, we'll stop, we'll camp, we'll fish, probably do some hunting. There's these like grouse called ptarmigan, and they're the Alaska state bird, actually. They're delicious. I'm sure that we were eating some ptarmigan. We're definitely fishing for grayling all the time. Grayling are these small fish that are in northern streams and lakes, and they fight like they're a 200-pound marlin. They are amazing, but they're not very big. Like a 13-inch grayling is really big. They're delicious. And we used to just catch those by the dozen. It's so fun if you're a little kid. There's me and David. This is later on. I can tell we're a higher altitude because you see there's no spruce trees. And we're by some shed antlers that we found. That was one of our main pastimes and joys, is just going around, because there's so few people out here, and people are not disturbing the landscape. So we're always finding antlers and collecting them. There's Monty drinking some water next to his horse. There's a caribou on a rise, pretty cool. Now, actually I'm going to back up. This is, this may be, this is near, the other thing that made a really big impression on me in this journey, somewhere right in the middle, we arrive at this place called Flat Creek. Now, it's just kind of an unassuming little creek like that. But the cool thing about Flat Creek, I don't think this is it, but it may be, is there were these boulders strewn all around Flat Creek. And now realize we're 200 miles from any coastline. We're nearly a mile high in elevation. We're probably above 4,000 feet. There were these massive boulders all around Flat Creek. And like, well, I'm 6 years old, so maybe they weren't this big, but there were all these chunks of rock. And if you look closely at these chunks of rock, they were just covered in fossils from the seafloor, like little weird snail shells and crustaceans and things. So I just sort of realized at 6 years old, I could put that together in my head. I'm 200 miles from any beach, and I'm this high, like way in the mountains. I'm so far from the ocean. This was an ocean floor. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, maybe millions of years ago, I started to, it was for me kind of a light bulb moment of understanding slow time and just the way our world is spinning and things are changing on a timeline that we can't even comprehend. And we're just here and we're gone like that. So finally, we arrive at horse pasture. This is horse pasture, and you see all those little speckles. I remember when we arrived there, I can picture it now. It was slightly overcast. It was an afternoon, meaning after a long day's ride. We pulled into horse pasture, and there's probably 5,000 caribou. This is what's called the Nelchina herd. And we rode right through the middle of the valley, and I remember the caribou just spread out, and we just went right through the middle of them. And they sort of, we set up camp, and they sort of stuck around for 3 or 4 days, and they started filtering out. But initially, we just camped right in the middle of this giant mass of caribou. And then here's our camp. That's kind of what it looks like. That's one of our teepees. You see the kids there. And there's 2 teepees together, and there's the wagon. Now, the other thing that I remember at horse pasture was we had all the horses. So what do you do with the horses? Well, you stake them out. So we had these things where they would take like a piece of rebar or find a bush or something and take like 50 feet of rope with a little like a collar at the end. You put it around the horse's ankle, and then they're basically tied down. They can kind of graze in this, sort of 50-foot diameter area. But the thing is, you got to move them 2 or 3 times a day so they have fresh food and they can graze, but then the horses aren't going to run away. So the adults were always leaving to go re-stake out the horses. And if you stay in one place for a longer time, you have to stake them out further and further away because they're eating all the grass. So one afternoon, all the adults are gone. I'm there with just my brother, David. My super young brother's probably with my mom. They're all gone. It's just me and David hanging out by the teepee. We're set up at a slightly different spot than this, but now picture it. We're in this valley. There's a creek. The teepee's right by the creek. It slopes down. There's the creek. Here's the teepee. I'm sitting inside the teepee. I remember it just like this. I look out through the door. I look down to the creek, and there's my brother David, and he's got his back to me. And his feet are in the creek. And he's washing his cowboy hat in the water. He's really proud of his cowboy hat. And across the creek from David is a small bear, like a cub, a pretty good-sized cub. It's definitely bigger than David. Now, I knew a cub can still be dangerous, but at 6 years old, I also knew that it was the mother that was really dangerous. There's no adults around. David doesn't see it, okay? It's probably, here's the edge of the creek. The creek's 3 or 4 feet wide. You could walk across it. I creep down the hill, right up behind David. He still doesn't see the bear. I can smell it. And I reached down and I took his hand. Now he sees the bear. And we just backed up the hill inside the teepee. And the bear watched us the whole time. We get to the top, and he just kind of moseyed off. He didn't even hurry. He just got up. He was sitting on his butt, kind of. Just wandered off through the bushes and disappeared. A little while later, the adults come back. I go, hey, Mom, we saw a bear. Nah, probably wasn't a bear. It was probably a porcupine or maybe a wolverine. No, it was a bear. Okay, it wasn't a bear. It's like, I might be 6, but I knew it was a bear, okay? Eventually, Mike and Cherry and Monty and Zeke left, so it was only my little family. They couldn't stay the whole summer, I guess. And one day, we went on this journey because above horse pasture, there's what's called the Little Oshetna River, and above that's the Big Oshetna River, which apparently there are fossilized dinosaur bones at. But I haven't been there and I haven't seen them. Well, one day we took a ride. No wagons, just everybody piled on a couple horses, and we ride up to the Little Oshetna River to check it out, to see the sights. And I remember this day very specifically. It's in a big, broad valley like this, and I kind of had this knack as a kid in that I was always the one finding things. I would always spot game first, and if there was something to find, I would always find it. And I don't know why, but I had that knack. And I remember walking along through the sand at the edge of the river. It's shallow water, and there in a sandbar, there's this pale item sticking out of the sand. And I reach down and I pick it up, and it's a can of Ham's beer. And now the top of it is bleached white. It's probably sat there so long in this sandbar. The other side is like brand new. It's been face down for years and years. Some hunter, someone, years before, left this can of beer there. It fell out of their backpack. It fell, I don't know how it ended up there. So, hey, check this out. I show my parents. I remember they cracked it open. I got to have a little, like a half a sip. Here, taste it. Because, you know, if you're in the mountains for months at a time, like you're eating very simple food. We'd have like oatmeal or a hot cereal for breakfast. You know, maybe we're eating fish at night. There's a lot of rice and beans. There's that kind of stuff. We don't have candy. There's not a lot of flavors. It's like, here, just taste this. And I remember that, and I remember that day. And now the next day, I wake up, and I remember the mood was very somber. There was an energy and a different vibe when I woke up, and I could feel it at 6 years old. And the first thing I wake up, I saw this red ribbon. And the red ribbon had tied to one end of it this little gaggle of, it was like a bolt with a bunch of washers and some nuts on it. It was like a weight. And I'd never seen that before. And the other thing is, if you're camping out of a wagon in a teepee all summer, you know every single item that exists. And I'd never seen that before. And where did that come from? And nobody was saying anything about it. And we had breakfast, and everybody's pretty quiet. And then my mom says, hey, let's go for a walk. And she takes my brother and I, and we sit down by the creek, and she says, there was an accident yesterday, and your father's dead. And she cried, and I cried, and David was too young, he didn't cry. And I realized at 6 years old that it can all go away like that. No matter who you are, no matter where you are. My dad went through the Vietnam War. He survived horrific things that I can't even imagine. And I can imagine a lot because I've seen some horrific things. I can't imagine that. And he's out on a Sunday afternoon with his friends, boom, and he's gone. And so I knew that at 6 years old. And I knew how finite this life is. Well, we stayed a few more weeks in horse pasture, and on a kind of drizzly morning, we rode out. And we moved on with our lives. And we used to, our ancestors would take animal fat and blood and pigments from plants and flowers, and they'd mix it all up, and they'd write on the walls of caves. Just like they're carving into stones. And you think about that. How long did it take them to figure that out, right? To get the right combination of animal fat and maybe this plant and maybe this kind of blood, and how does that all work? Because we're so creative. We're so driven to tell these stories. We have all this amazing technology now. We have all these awesome cameras and all these awesome lenses. And it's good to have all that stuff, and you need it, and it helps you tell a story. But I shared this story because it took me a long time to realize, probably deep into my 40s. Yes, all those tools are amazing, whether you're finger painting on the wall of a cave, or you've got a $10,000 lens in your hand. The lens you're looking through is every experience you've ever had in your life, okay? All of our lives, for us individually, our lives are a mythological journey. And you have these characters and these people in your life growing up, events that are amazing, wonderful, tragic. You have these figures in your life that reach sort of mythological importance, and they influence you for years, for decades, for your whole life. We are all individually overcoming Herculean odds, that are Herculean battles, right? Mythological battles. We're slaying dragons. We're fighting wars that sometimes people don't even know about. We're all the hero of our own journey. Sometimes we're the villain of our own journey. But if you're going to go out there and share stories and share your perspective with other people, which is what we're driven to do, we can't help it. It's why this building is full of all of everybody. I'll say it again. The lens that's the most powerful, the lens that's your most potent weapon, your greatest asset, is that singular lens that's only your own. You're looking through every experience that you've ever had. Thank you. Thank you for coming. And my time's not up if you guys have any questions. Yes, thank you. Yes, I should have made that clear. So early that morning, a guy flew over in an airplane and dropped a note that was news of my father's death, and it was tied to that red ribbon. Yeah. Yeah.
Just at the beginning, where were those petroglyphs? The location of petroglyphs at the beginning?
Those are in northeastern Nevada, way up in the middle of nowhere. There's no road that even takes you there.
Monitor Valley?
No. No. No, sort of southeast of Reno, way back in the mountains. Yeah. That place is littered with them. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So how hard was it to adapt to college after going through all of that?
I think I'm still sort of adapting to normal life, to tell you the truth. I'm not sure if I have completely adapted.
Was that like a sensory overload going to college after living in the wilderness for so many years?
It was strange. It was really strange to have an indoor shower. You know, we used to bathe. We had a wood stove to cook on. So I had to chop wood year round, and my mom would heat up a big pot of water and then pour it into a galvanized, have you ever seen those old galvanized tubs? And then, you know, that you'd strip down and sit in that, and that's how you bathed. Yeah.
Where'd you wind up going to college?
I went to Louisiana. My girlfriend in high school was from there, and so after high school she moved back there, and I thought, well, I need to go to college somewhere. I might as well go there. And spoiler alert, I only lasted like a year. I couldn't really deal with Louisiana. Nothing against it. If you're from there, it's a beautiful place. It didn't suit me well.
Culture shock.
Yes, culture shock. Yes.
I
Yes,
have
sir.
a question. How have you applied the lens that is your life to the professional work that you're doing?
That's a really good question, and I think, of course, it's the obvious one and the hardest one. And I think I didn't realize for a long time that was happening. But you know, I didn't talk about this. Professionally, I'm a cinematographer half the time, and half the time I'm sort of director/producer. I do a lot of non-scripted stuff for Discovery Channel, so they don't often credit you as a director, but that's basically what I'm doing. And I'm talking to people and filming them in real life situations. And I noticed when I started doing this work right away, I noticed that I just related to a lot of times people in certain situations differently than my coworkers. And that oftentimes, not all the time, I am able to relate to them in a closer way, or maybe with a little more empathy or a little more understanding in some cases. And I do think it's from my background, and especially, you know, sometimes people that live in rural situations, or oftentimes I find myself in other countries, and I've worked a lot around, you know, people who are very disadvantaged and things, and it's just, I think that I've been able to connect with them, and I know it's because of my background. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
If it's okay to ask, where's mom now?
She passed away in 2019, right before the pandemic. So yeah, she had some health issues, and she had a good death. Look, you know, myself and 3 of my siblings were holding her when she passed, and it was horrible, but it was amazing. And yeah. We won't all get that nice of a death. So yeah, I'm grateful for it. Appreciate you guys coming.
One more. I have a follow-up question. What was it that got you into film work?
Okay, great. So growing up the way I did, you know, cameras were always kind of a special, it was always kind of a sacred object, but they seemed like something that I didn't deserve to use, or I didn't have the skill set. Later, you know, I sort of realized, well, why didn't you just go to school for that? But that never really occurred to me. I'm a slow learner, you guys. So eventually, so long story short, right when I got out of high school, I bought like an Instamatic little film camera. This is, of course, in the early 90s, so that's what I bought. Because it didn't have interchangeable lenses. I didn't have to learn about lenses or anything. I just put a roll of film in and boom, and I shot thousands of pictures with that thing, and then I upgraded to like an Olympus. But what I really wanted was a video camera. So at the age of 22, I finally had enough money. I maxed out my credit card, and I bought like the most expensive video camera I could get, which was like a Canon Hi8 video camera. And I was really big into mountain climbing at the time. I lived in Alaska, and I was ice climbing and mountain climbing and doing that, and I wanted to film that stuff. So I just aggressively, I was taking this camera everywhere, filming everything. And then after a couple years, I said, I need to make movies. I want to make films. And in 1999, I moved to Los Angeles to make films. And I didn't know a single person. I didn't know how to do anything professionally. I actually didn't even know how to white balance the camera, or I didn't know that you needed to white balance a camera. You know, there was barely the internet back then. There's no YouTube. There's nothing. So I just started kind of trying to make stuff and meet people and figure it out. And one thing led to another, and now it's sort of the job. Yeah.
All right, one more round of applause. Thank you so much, Ben.